Yeah, this is DNN. This is Disclosure News Network. And what we do is we try to dig down to the truth and try to have guests that are really credible and they know what they're talking about. And we got that guest tonight again. And the guy that's below me or above me, he's a producer and co-host, Rob Adams, and he'll be watching real close, and he's got a big stick. He can reach through the Zoom and hit me with it. But no, we work together as a team here, and we don't double up on the guest. But my name's Dave Emmons, Rob Adams, and our guest tonight is David White. And I will read you a little bit about him. He's got a whole lot to go, and usually with the people that are very credible and been in research for a long time, they have a lot to say and they do a lot of research. So here's David White's, let me intro him. Award-winning writer with 20 years of experience creating content for Chicago area advertisers and publishers with multiple completed screenplays and novels. Experiencer with 3 UFO sightings, that's what I like to hear. Just orbs, but other witnesses saw the same orbs. One encounter with an actual man in black, and that's another story that we want to hear. A 1960s Cadillac, shiny, and they appear in those Cadillacs. They must like Cadillacs. And a witness by 4 other people. One strange encounter that what may have been a Sasquatch experience, moderately psychic with abilities of psychometry, psychometry, I guess. Okay, I got it. And reading images from touching an object, remote viewing, verified under double-blind testing, and precognition, mostly through UAPs, military history, conspiracy theories, astronomy, and more recent quantum physics. And also he's got several books. He's got chapter 1 of the novel, Eternal Horizons, the synopsis of the series built around Eternal Horizons, the first 2 episodes for my serious TV drama about very real men in black. And we want to hear more about that. And he's got an article about the TikTok or Tic-Tac UFO videos the government is putting out there with the Pentagon. He's got Pentagon disinformation, and he's got an article about that. And Travis Walton, we'll hear more about that tonight. And the state of UFOs today, and that's what we want to look at for disclosure. But he's had over 20 years experience working with a number of Chicago area advertisers and publishers. So he's been in the writing business a long time. He's done a lot of research. He's recently edited and helped rewrite adventure novel for an English client, The Druid's Chair. And he's done some filming and worked with some screenplay writers, and he filmed in the Chicago area. He wrote the feature-length script Dreamers and a screenplay in Los Angeles where he edited close to 80% of that entire script, and he's got some very good, favorable results and people that support him on his writing. His writing is very creative, apparently, and he does a really good job, and we look forward to talking to him. And also, he's done screenplays like Alive Till Dead, Black.
It's my spoof on James Bond.
Oh, okay. Blackmail under glass, and H is for human, missile number 6, and Oblivion. And David, why don't you just talk about a little bit more about that kind of stuff, okay?
Okay, so you and I are both experiencers.
Right.
Okay. I answered a question on one of the Facebook pages I belong to, where they were asking, what do we need to do in order to vet people who claim that they've had an abduction experience or they've had a close encounter with UFOs? And after 20 or 30 replies, I replied, it's not really up to us to vet somebody else's experience. It seems to me that the close contact experiences we had, and not just the close contact ones, but just the sightings, appear to be designed for individual people to see. If they wanted to show themselves to the world, they would have done that, 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. They don't seem to be interested in convincing us all at once. They seem to be interested in convincing us one at a time. I don't know if that means that they have a long-term plan, might go 100 years, might go another 1,000 years. or if they're just interested in dealing with us on a one-to-one basis. The sightings that I had, and I went, there are a lot of people out there that go, why can't I get a UFO sighting? I've been praying to them. I've been trying to talk to them. I go to these CE5 conferences and all I see are flares being dropped over the ocean. I was in my mid-50s before I saw a UFO. And it was just an orb over the horizon, but it was completely stationary. It was a brilliant orange color. It was bigger than the full moon, which is, by the way, only about half the size of your little finger held at arm's length.
Right.
That's as big as the full moon is. But it was a little bigger than that, and it was clearly not an airplane. It was not a reflection of a car like the Lubbock lights might have been. Wasn't a helicopter, wasn't a Chinese lantern, wasn't any normal thing. It was an orange light, and it was not there seconds before, because my son and I and my two daughters were scanning the southern horizon looking for lights, and it just like blipped on. And I remember telling my son, don't take your eyes off, because they have this annoying tendency of going out as soon as you take your eyes off. So he watched it for a few minutes while I went to light a bonfire. This was in one of our fields. And he looked away at me for a second and looked back, and it was gone. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I wrote it up, sent it in to MUFON, had it published. About a year later, there was a moment where I saw two brilliant white lights that were the color of like a magnesium flare. But it was over a field at the end of our driveway, which is about 200 feet long. And there's nothing in that direction. The nearest town is 7 miles away. There's no house in that direction. And these things, they were bright enough that it looked like a 747 was going to land in our driveway. And I yelled at my kids. They're watching it out the front window. Interestingly, my ex-wife would not look. She did not want to see this. Even though she could have gotten off the couch, taken 3 steps, turned and looked out the window, she would have seen it too, but she chose not to. So I told my kids, okay, you keep watching this. And I went to the front room and I had eyes on it. I told them to join me. And then I said, I'm going outside, keep watching this. And I went out the front door, and between the time that I went out the front door, took about 2 steps, passed on one side of a giant maple tree to the other side, about 10 feet in diameter. It had gone out. And I was so mad. I was so frustrated. I actually stomped down to the edge of the driveway, yelling and swearing up at an empty sky, saying, I know you're there. You know I know you're there. Come on, show yourselves. What the hell are you doing? Stop playing games. My daughter actually had to come out and say, Dad, calm down, calm down. They're not going to show themselves. They're gone. And that's indicative of a lot of UFO experiences. They're frustratingly brief. They're hard to, quantify. They don't leave any evidence. It's almost like they're trying to play with us. Or they're doing something where they're just convincing us one at a time that they're real, and that's all they need to do. And, obviously now I'm convinced that there's something there. That was not a plane, a helicopter, a balloon. It was not swamp gas. It was not anything other than something that could turn itself off between the time it took me to go from one side of a tree to the other side. Okay. Right.
The orange orbs, David, are usually the common thing. A lot of people have seen these orange orbs. So right. you're not, you're talking realism here. I mean, there's a lot right. of sightings of the orange orbs. Also, you're right about how the ET operate. They only show you. I've got witnesses to some of my events, but not to all of them. But even if you got witnesses, it's hard to explain to people. Right. If you got more than one experience, then it makes it more difficult to explain. Right. You're only allowed one, it looks like, from the public's viewpoint, and then that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And yet we have, really famous sightings like the Phoenix Lights, the earlier 8 p.m. one, not the 10 o'clock disinformation one, where the helicopters were dropping flares west of town on the other side of the mountain range. That, if you look up in Google what Phoenix Lights is, that 9 times out of 10 is the image you're going to see of these white lights behind the mountain range. But the earlier sighting was spotted by maybe as many as 800 people, was actually spotted by Governor Fife Symington at the time, even though he went 10 years before he admitted that he saw it. And this was a giant delta-shaped craft that was like a big, upside down V with lights on, like it was trying to be seen. It was not something that we had.
Yeah, there's theories about that. They say that was something that we had is a big flying wing, but I don't believe it either. I'm like you. I don't believe that we have something that huge, or why would we fly it over populated areas?
Well, now we can get into some other stories like the 2017 Nevada to California to Oregon to Washington tic-tac shaped object that was pacing commercial airliners.
Right.
That looked like it was trying to be seen, except that's really nothing more than what a cruise missile can do. They might be trying, they being the government, the US government, the Pentagon, the different Black Project agencies, may be trying to convince our adversaries, primarily China and Russia, that we have back engine technology. However, if you study military history, especially modern military history, the last 75 years or so, you'll find that at least the US military will always rush new projects into combat as soon as possible. Some people would suggest that we start wars just so that we can test new technology. A perfect example is the Balkan War that happened during the Clinton administration, where the only 2 fatalities in the United States military were 2 pilots of the newly released Black Hawk helicopters that crashed because they weren't quite ready to come out yet. And those actually had to be pulled from service because they weren't ready. The same thing happened with the Osprey helicopter/airplane. That thing crashed repeatedly, and we tried to get into combat, but it just wasn't ready. And we have time and time again shown a willingness to put practically anything that's right off the drawing board into combat as soon as possible. If we had these delta wing vehicles, if we had these flat-sided triangles, these massive, one description was bigger than a super Walmart UFOs, we'd be using them in combat right now. And we would have used them over the last 20 years. And we haven't, because we don't have those. Those are not ours.
I have an opinion on that, and Rob might too. I'm looking at the cabal, the deep state, and the New World Order, and I've heard a lot of people say that the government, the military especially, they're about 50 years ahead of where we're at as civilians, what they're telling us. And they're putting boots on the ground because I guess they're trying to lower the population. Does that sound crazy? Is that a cabal?
Are you familiar with the Georgia Guidestones?
Yeah.
Okay. The Georgia Guidestones, which were created by a group whose the person that paid for it was named Rosencrantz? Not Rosencrantz.
Yeah, I can't remember the name. Yeah.
He had a connection to the Rosicrucians. And a lot of people think this is a New World Order plan of how they're going to decimate the population. And when COVID first came out, there were a lot of people saying, well, this is it. This is the New World Order trying to lower the population. What it appears really to have been was this was something that was designed to survive what they thought was an impending world calamity that would leave only 500 million people left worldwide. And they put all these different languages onto the Georgia Guidestones so that these laws, these 10 different things you should do, would be memorable to the 500 million people left. It doesn't appear to be, as far as I can tell, our government doesn't want to have fewer people. Our government wants to have more people in more places. They just want to be able to have more taxes so they can spend more money. My feeling is the UAP videos that the Pentagon has released, and if you look carefully at what they're saying these could be a threat. We need to study them. We need more money to study them. And if they're a threat, we're going to need bigger and more expensive military systems to try to counter them.
That was one of their big fears. Yeah, that was one of their big fears about releasing the information, scaring people to death, having them jump off the buildings like back in the 30s when they had that War of the Worlds then, Mars invasion. And
we get into this conflict where so many people claim that you can't have a conspiracy because look at all the people that it would involve, somebody would talk. And they point out that the most important military operation of World War II, arguably, was the Manhattan Project. And even that was penetrated by Soviet agents, by communist agents. Except you can look through history and you can see all these different projects and all these different plans and operations that were completely secret until one person spilled the beans or somebody released a document that they shouldn't have released. And until we get that information, yeah, those things are perfectly valid conspiracy theories. A great example is the Northwoods Project, where before Kennedy left office, he had to cancel a project that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were wholly behind, where we were going to use airplanes and crash them into America and blame it on the Cubans. So we would have an excuse to go in and invade Cuba and get rid of Castro. We had plans in that same project to sink boats of refugees and blame it on Castro. And Kennedy was apparently the only sane person in that group that said, no, we're not going to do this. And for a long while, people didn't believe that we would ever have a project like that until it came out that, yeah, we not only had a project, it went up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was still being, considered as a real plan. People used to think that MK Ultra was a fictional narrative, that nobody in the United States government would ever do anything like this. And not only did they find out that MK Ultra was real and was being used on people, many times people who were unwillingly participating in this project, but that there were a bunch of other projects both before and after MK Ultra that did the same thing and worse.
Yeah, they completely erased their memories, so they didn't know what they did when they were assigned to a project or some kind of a hit job they were involved in. They wouldn't remember anything. Same thing the ETs do to you. They erase your memory and only give you bits and pieces in a regression.
I'm hesitant to blame some of the negative aspects on aliens. I know that there is a lot of evidence of what are called MILABs. What people think means MILABs, meaning military laboratories. It really stands for military abductions. Even back during the time when they were making the X-Files, one of the famous intros for one of their episodes shows a UFO landing and these two alien creatures, tall gray aliens, come up to this car with two people in it, and the people in the car pass out from shock. And then a real UFO lands. And one of the guys in the alien costume talks to the other guy and says, "What the hell is that?" And the story spins off that these are military personnel disguised as aliens, because X-Files wanted to talk about MILABs. And
you're talking about cattle mutilations too, with the black helicopters. You think that's probably?
Yes. It's interesting that we never saw the kind of surgical procedures with, precision cutting with what looks to be a laser on cattle and horses and other creatures until the early 60s, when we finally perfected laser technology. We're not seeing that in the 1920s and 30s. It only starts in the mid 60s, and it only starts in one place in Colorado. It doesn't happen in Brazil. It doesn't happen in Europe. It doesn't happen anywhere else. Just one location that maybe the US military has a connection. And I think it's part of a continuing process since 1941, where the United States government doesn't want our public to know that A, we can't protect them from whatever these things are flying around our skies, and B, hey, let's keep whatever we find a secret from our adversaries.
Well, there's been secrets for thousands of years, David, even back in Egyptian times. Only the high priest knew the real secrets of the society and the world and what's going on. They had control that way. And I guess also you have written about some articles about Roswell, and we go back there, and you're saying that maybe it was the Russians or maybe even the Nazis who made this craft?
Oh, no, I'm not saying that at all.
Okay.
I'm saying that the US government was originally worried that it might have been back-engineered Nazi technology that the Russians had gotten from their German scientists that they had captured at the end of the war. We knew from our German scientists that they were working on other projects, but it appears from the best, most sober evidence we can gather that none of these really got off the ground. They didn't have access to the kind of metals that they needed. They couldn't even get enough heavy water to get their nuclear power plant started, because the nuclear the material they had, they only had enough to probably make a dirty bomb. They didn't have enough to make an actual functioning fission bomb like we did. And it appears that as soon as it looked like this was real wreckage from something unexplained, the US military put a clamp on it because they didn't want the Russians to know that we had found this. So they came up with this, crazy story that this was a weather balloon. Except the weather balloon is made out of balsa wood and basically an early form of mylar and string. And there's no way that the 509th Bomb Group, which was the only operational atomic bomb group in the world at that time, which had access to every technology that we had. I mean, they were the highest clearance military personnel that we had. There's no way that they wouldn't have been able to identify that immediately. I mean, most of those weather balloons actually had like an address on them. If you find this, send this to such and such, and there's a reward. That's not what this was. However, since Roswell, there have been fake story after fake story after fake story. I think they're up on 5 now. No, it wasn't that. We were lying before. It's really this.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most interesting features of Roswell, though, is that there is a 6-month gap in the communications going into and out of Roswell Army Airfield, where it appears that all of their incoming and outgoing transmissions just evaporate. They claim that it was destroyed in a fire, except I can't find another airbase in the last 75 years where they lost 6 months of all their ingoing and outgoing material. We're talking telexes, we're talking phone records, we're talking everything that they would have used to communicate to their superiors and other contractors, just gone. And it just happens to coincidentally cover the time period when this event happened.
Yes, you made you made some very good comments on the website, and Rob and I both really appreciated your comments and your insight. And you was talking about the Roswell story in one of the comments, and I brought up, and I think Rob is the one who sent me this article. Isn't that right, Rob, about this Army nurse?
Yep.
Did you want to elaborate on that, or did you study that?
You can if you want. I've got a couple points I want to.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Rob is more of a real focused, I guess, journalist. And here I am. I just float all over the place. So David, forgive me about this, but no, the nurse that the story that we heard and what Rob sent me, I don't remember her name, but she was an Army nurse. She was at Roswell at the time in 1947. Mm-hmm. And she was selected since she could communicate. There was a name, and it was a she, I think they said it was. It was a female alien. Her name was Eva, something like that. Ava or Eva, something.
EBE, which stands for Extraterrestrial Biological Entity.
Well, I think they give her a name though, wasn't it?
Yeah, in the article they actually
Ava, yeah.
They have.
Yeah. Ava. So she communicated with her for 2 or 3 years, and of course this alien passed away. So what kind of information did we get from that experience? And this lady, I guess she must have been in 2007, she must have passed away or something, but she told all this stuff, and she was truthful about it, sounds like. And it's like your deathbed confessions, in which a lot of these top secret people are doing now, because they won't get in trouble or won't get hurt from it. But she made this confession after so many years and talked about it. So that kind of, if that's for real, then that's a fact that we can't ignore.
And yes, you point out if that's real, and it's really hard to vet things once people pass away and we don't have, any connection to talk to them, to cross-reference who they were speaking to, who might be able to corroborate that information. What's really interesting is a lot of people think that the modern UFO situation started with Roswell in July of 47. A lot of people forget that there was the Battle of Los Angeles in February of 1942. And whatever that object was, there's a famous photograph where it's spotted in spotlights from the ground. And we fired at this thing for an hour and a half. We sent 1,300 shells up at this thing, and it didn't affect it. That was not a balloon. That was not a helicopter. That was not a plane. Whatever that thing was, was immune to whatever we could throw at it. And then at some point, it just floated inland and continued on its merry way. It was so dangerous that it actually killed 3 people on the ground, partly from one guy had a heart attack and 2 other people were killed by falling debris from the anti-aircraft shells.
Right, the shrapnel, yeah.
And right after that, there is this document. We can't exactly tell if it's true or not, but there is a document that has the signature of George Marshall, who was the highest ranking military officer in the United States at the time. This is before we had the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was started enough in 1947, same year as Roswell. George Marshall apparently signed off on creating a group called the Interplanetary Phenomena Unit, or the IPU, because they believed this was not Russian or Japanese or German. It had to be other. It had to be extraterrestrial. And even though we have that document, there is no document saying this IPU unit has ever been retired or canceled or expunged. That's one of the things that I put into my TV series, Silencers, that I go under the assumption that, okay, maybe this is a real document. Maybe that's where we have this private group that advises the politicians at the highest level and the military, and is sort of above what the president can.
Right. Now you write about the silencers, and the silencers you're talking about are MIBs, Men in Black. And
Yes.
you had an occurrence or an event with them and witnesses. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So in the late 80s, I helped launch a magazine called Electronic Gaming Monthly, which people who were old enough, like you and me, to play video games, especially computer games back then, and the early Nintendo and Commodore 64 gaming platforms, we covered video games, computer games. We gave them walkthroughs, all that kind of thing.
I remember that magazine.
There you go.
I used to read it.
Lots of color, lots of walkthroughs.
I was a VIC-20 Commodore 64 guy. So.
Yeah, you two guys are youngsters compared to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Atari. We covered the Atari.
Yeah.
So we had a second magazine called Computer Gaming Monthly, and in that section, I wanted a end of the magazine couple of pages called the Men in Black. And this was going to cover the new technology that was coming out and the technicians that created that technology. Well, one day, this is in the western suburbs of Chicago, I was going to have a meeting at my house with 4 of the people that worked with me, 4 young guys between 20 and 25. And they showed up to my house first before I got home. I pulled in the driveway, which is at the side of the house, went into the garage, which is, not attached to the house, and I came in through the back door. So I never went through the front door where they did. And I met these 4 guys, and they were all mad as hell. They were beet red. They looked like they'd been fighting. And I said, "What's the problem?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, right. Like you don't know." And I said, "No, I don't know." "Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, funny, ha ha." And I said, "What are you guys talking about?" And they're like, "Oh, go look outside your front door." So I said, "Okay." So I went to my front door. It's probably about 30 feet from the road. The road is a little suburban street, with cars that park on one side of the street and traffic in the other 2 lanes. And slightly to the east of my house, on the opposite side, was a pristine 1960s Cadillac. It was beautiful. I had never seen it. Almost looked like it was more beautiful than real. Okay, like movie type beautiful. I remembered seeing 2 interesting details. It had red leather in the open area behind the rear window, which I found out leather wasn't really, at least red leather, wasn't something that Cadillacs had at the time. It would have to be an aftermarket add-on. And it had a purplish violet kind of glow coming from the front right passenger's side. And this was 5:30 in the afternoon. I don't know how I saw this purple glow, but it wasn't dark. It wasn't something that would have illuminated the car at night. It was something that I could see in the daytime. And in the driver's seat, through an open window, I could see a man with skin as white as snow, who had his head poking out of the window and looking back over his left shoulder at me. He didn't seem to have any hair on. And while he's watching me, he pulls the car out into traffic and drives down the road and never looks back at the area in front of him. Down the road, he's looking at me the whole time, which freaked me out. I mean, that was that was not something that somebody just set up as a prank. That was as close as I can imagine to a real MIB experience.
He was white. You said he was pale white. What else did he? What other features did he have?
I
Dark eyes?
can't remember what he was wearing, to be honest. It was just that there are little bits and pieces that struck me. And as soon as I came out, he looked at me and slowly drove away. So he was only there for a few seconds, maybe 5 seconds at most. But apparently the other 4 gentlemen, they all saw the same thing. And it scared me enough. I mean, I'm not an easy person to scare. That terrified me, because that meant either these things are real, or somebody in the government wants you to think they're real. And if they'll go to this much trouble to scare you, maybe you should leave them alone.
Yeah, there's been other people who've told me in the past that they have seen real MIBs, and they're freaky looking. They're dark eyes, and they're mechanical in their ways. They only say a very few words, and then they walk away. But then you have the military people who get involved. Maybe they want to, maybe the story isn't true, and the military wants to put it down and say, okay, don't talk about this anymore. This didn't happen. Don't scare the public. That's the goodness in my heart coming out about that. But there's also other people saying that there are secret organization, these MIBs, and they work for both ETs and military.
Well, so I stopped I stopped investigating UFOs and Men in Black for about 10 years. I went into ancient archaeology. I studied, the pyramids and pre-Incan stonework, and I've got a whole, subgenre of information that I've gleaned from that. The short answer to that is somebody built stone 10, 12,000 BC that the people at that time could not have built. And we can talk about that later too. But it took me about 10 years to get back into UFOs and Men in Black, and I decided I was going to write a TV pilot called Silencers, in honor of UFO Silencers by Timothy Green Beckley. That's his book right there. Timothy passed away earlier this year. He was a great writer. He was a great investigator. He pulled no punches. He and Jenny Randles did 2 of the best books on Men in Black. As far as I can tell, as I was doing the research for Silencers, my TV pilot, there appear to be multiple groups that call themselves Men in Black, or that we call Men in Black. There is the sort of swarthy looking Oriental types who were considered to be short-ish, but very thick, very wide, almost always traveling in a group of 3 where there's 2 guys behind him who are big and beefy and never talk. And these Oriental guys seem to have almost greenish skin, like very dark olive colored skin. These guys are almost always threats. They try to get people not to talk about a UFO event where the witness might not have told anybody else that they ever saw a UFO, and yet these Men in Black will show up the next day and tell them, keep quiet, don't tell anybody. So
let's go back to that meeting with the 4 guys. There's got to be a reason why MIB got involved with you, and there's got to be a reason why these other 4 guys were afraid. What was your meeting about that night?
Yeah, what was their interaction with them?
Right.
It was just going to be a discussion of the computer magazine and where we were going to go in the future. We didn't really have a future after that. That so scared the 5 of us that we kind of went our separate ways. It stopped my investigations in UFOs for almost 10 years. And it actually sent me into what I consider a more significant area of study, that being prehistoric archaeology. Starting around, say, 4000 BC with the launch of the Sumerian and the Egyptian
Here's
dynasties.
Go
ahead.
More pointed to my question is, did those 4 individuals interact with the MIBs? Was there any interaction? Why were they so upset and afraid?
Because it didn't seem real. And I think they thought, they told me, they thought I had planned that I was trying to pull a joke on them.
Okay.
And it looked too real for that. The little details like, the red leather inside the Cadillac and the violet colored light from the front passenger seat. those are details I've never heard before in a Men in Black thing. You wouldn't need to do that if you were just going to try to show off somebody owns a black Cadillac. And the fact that this guy, I mean, I was at least 30 feet away, more like probably 45 feet away. And it wasn't like that I could actually see his face well enough to know he didn't have hair. It was like I knew he didn't have hair. Some of the descriptions of Men in Black in my series, every episode has a historic event dramatically recreated so that you can see what people claim that they've seen. There's a really famous story where a guy showed up at a doctor's house and he had not only no hair on his head, he had no eyelashes. He had not just no eyebrows, he had no eyelashes on his eyes. Do you know how hard that would be to do? I mean, you'd have to figure out some way to pull those eyelashes out, which has got to be incredibly painful if you can even do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a theory that like those mass sightings that we were talking about before, that they actually appear and that they're basically gauging what the reaction is of the population down below. And I've heard it kind of extrapolated from there is that when someone does see a craft, they can then gauge the propensity of them to talk about it or to talk about it within circles that they might not necessarily want, and thus the visitation.
Right.
So it's that's kind of interesting to me that, and I think it's plausible too, because when I was a kid in late 70s, early 80s, reading about the MIBs, I was like, wow, this is kind of incredible stuff. But as the theory kind of fleshed out, I was like, well, that actually kind of makes sense, is how they would know exactly who saw what and what their reaction was.
Yeah. Right.
But that's not the only kind. So we have the Oriental kind. We have the kind with no hair, which are almost always white. In this same instance where the doctor was visited by this Men in Black at night, he was one of the first Men in Black described as having a bowler hat and a perfectly pressed outfit almost, where there wasn't a single wrinkle on his clothing. Now we've seen that there are Men in Black that appear to be sort of impersonating military personnel. There's a really famous event from the 50s where a town where 200 people in this little town saw a UFO. Somebody from the local Air Force base called the mayor and said, I want you to gather everybody into the gymnasium at the high school, and we're going to have a little talk. So this Air Force guy and his subordinates show up, and he begins to tell the people in this gymnasium, you did not see what you think you saw. And the mayor and a bunch of other people get a little upset. And he's like, you're not hearing me. You didn't see this. And, he leaves, and they're so upset. They call the Air Force base, and the Air Force base says, I don't know who you're talking about. We don't have anybody here at our base with that name.
You think
So-
maybe they're operating out of the parameters of the Air Force regulations?
We know that at least one incident happened where the military appeared to threaten a group of people to shut up about a UFO that they saw. Other than that, we really don't know. It's very likely that early on they did that kind of threats. There's the story of the sheriff's family at Roswell who were threatened by military people after Roswell, where they said, we'll take you out into the desert and they'll never find your body.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the sheriff and the sheriff's family being threatened by the military. So we can conclude that, yes, they have made those threats in the past. One of my articles talks about how there's a really good article by the author and the man who runs the Daily Grail website, where he talks about how there have been demonstrable incidents in the past where the military, the Pentagon, whoever at the Pentagon, not just interfered with UFO information and research, but actually was willing to let people die in order to accomplish their goals. So we can tell that the military has definitely had a hand in trying to keep the lid on things. Okay, so it's possible that some of these these Men in Black instances might be military or CIA agents. It's interesting. I hate to diverge for a little bit,
It's okay.
but one of the things I studied was this thing called a CIA series of documents called the Family Jewels. And this came about because in the heat of Watergate, somebody at the White House had asked the CIA for a locksmith to help them break into the Democratic National Committee so they could steal some files. And it came out later that the CIA complied, which is against their charter, and they could be decertified as an agency for breaking those kind of laws. So the head of the CIA at that time, in the early 80s, said, I want all of you people in my departments to bring to me all the worst things, all the most illegal things that the CIA has ever done, and I want it in my hand. And so they put together this giant list, which was supposed to stay secret and classified. This was then called the Family Jewels. This was recently, I think it was 2007, declassified, except for Family Jewel number 1, which is completely redacted on the first page. They have a list. This is the first thing on that page, and it's blacked out. And there are 2 pages that explain what this number 1 thing was. Those are completely redacted too. They talk in this document about trying to assassinate Castro, trying to assassinate other world leaders, overthrowing governments, using LSD in a town in France where they dosed the whole town through their water supply. All these horrible, criminal, awful things that they did.
Yeah.
And yet, whatever item number 1 is, they couldn't release that information. And there's 2 things that they don't talk about in this document. They don't talk about the Kennedy assassination. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the CIA was directly involved in the Kennedy assassination to some degree. And they don't talk about UFOs. So what I've realized is there's 2 things we can learn from that. Number 1, whatever that thing was, it was so dangerous that we can't talk about it. And number 2, if it was the CIA talking about UFOs, then they couldn't talk about the Kennedy assassination. But if it's the Kennedy assassination that's still redacted, that means they couldn't talk about UFOs. One of those 2 subjects is still so hot, they can't even put it down on paper and redact.
Yeah, this all started with President Truman with the Majestic 12 getting into all this secrecy. And then the CIA, I think, evolved from that. You had an article.
Oh, wait, hold on. Before you go there, don't leave that there.
Okay.
There is a great deal of discussion going on about the MJ12 documents. Stanton Friedman didn't think they were real. He thought they were a hoax. Other researchers have shown that it's very likely, in the best circumstance, it's partly true and partly disinformation. There's a lot of mistakes in the way that the documents were prepared, where they don't show the right way that the military would, for example, classify dates. There are events like the Eisenhower middle of the night dentist appointment when he was in California, where he supposedly met with alien representatives, except there's not exactly enough evidence to prove that really happened. So I'm hesitant to say that the MJ12 documents are completely believable. I'd only rate them about 35 or 40% truth, and the rest is maybe just made up so that we as the public can't tell what's real and what's not.
Yeah, they had a film of the meeting of Eisenhower and the aliens on the tarmac, and that's a short film. It wasn't very long, and it was stolen or picked up or sent somewhere else. And there's been all this kind of disinformation ever since this whole thing started, and they're confusing us. And it's just like you're talking about the MIBs. I've heard of them looking Asian too, and actually I met an Asian, hybrid or whatever she was. But that goes into confusion also. They're confusing us. Even the MIBs, when they come and talk to you, and they try to scare you, they're just confusing us where we're at today. Fake news. We don't know what to believe. So
well, let's take a moment and look at the current 5 Pentagon UAP videos. Okay, I rely a lot on this fine, educated, sober researcher named Mick West. A lot of people don't like Mick West because he's a little too honest in some of the things he says. He's a little too direct. He's gotten in trouble for some of his Twitter comments where he has basically come out and said, definitively, this is X. And I try to be a little bit less definitive, but I do appreciate the fact that he's an expert in infrared cameras. And for every one of those 5 UAPs, he's not just been able to prove that these were not unidentified, but that he can show you exactly how those videos are made. He can show you, like, for example, when the gimbal video shows this object supposedly rotating, well, it's because of the gimbal mount. And the gimbal mount has a certain kind of technological computer assist, where if the pilot's moving, you don't want to see the horizon in the video move, so it realigns the horizon for you. But if the camera pod itself is moving, then that image will shift irrespective of the horizon. So it makes it look like this object is doing this when it really isn't. And he shows how you can do that with a flashlight and your own cell phone camera, which does the same thing. You can move your cell phone camera and it'll look like this object is moving, but you can see that the object's not moving. The light is moving in the receptor of the camera. And he's shown, you know, in all 5 cases, these are not unidentified. And the military has to know this. The military knows their technology better than anybody. How are they not able to say this is identified? This is a heat signature. This thing that supposedly goes into the water and there's a splashdown. You can see that it's going behind the horizon, because just before it disappears for a second and then reappears. It's not because it goes up and down, it's because it's behind the water and the wave goes up and covers it for a second and then comes back down. It's either a plane going over a long distance, or it's just the sun. And he also points out in that particular video that somebody cut 6 minutes out of this video, so it makes it look like it happened really fast, but they edited it out. And the military has to know this. It's not even the actual radar footage or sensor footage from that ship. It's somebody with the cell phone camera taking a picture of the actual display. So it's 1 generation removed. And all the Pentagon has claimed so far is that these are unidentified and they were taken by military personnel. They will not say these are UFOs, but they should have been honest and come out and said, well, we know what these are. These aren't unidentified. But they're playing us. They're playing us by trying to make us worried about, oh my God, this is proof of UFOs. Hey, throw another couple of $1 billion at us.
As a side note, yesterday the National Defense Appropriations Act was passed, and there was established in the Pentagon there's going to be a formal office for UAPs. So
yep. Right. And I don't have a problem with that, because yes, there are things in our sky. I mean, Stephenville is a perfect example. In 2007, there's a greater than Walmart-sized UFO with flat size flashing sigils, flashing images, icons at the people on the ground. And they rustle up a couple of F-16s on afterburner that come after this thing, and it leaves them in the dust. And it not just goes away, it overflies the Bush Ranch, the Western White House, while President Bush is there. So it's basically violating a whole number of protocols, and we can't stop it.
So how are we going to distinguish from what, I know you wrote an article about what is real and what is not? These pilots say that these objects were real. They were from somewhere else. And right. You have a lot of pilots on the East Coast, Navy pilots, they were afraid of their airspace getting dangerous because of these UFOs. So is this story just really scripted, really fine, or?
Well, Mick West makes an interesting point. We can't discern what people saw. We can only go off of the evidence they provide. And so far, the 5 UAP videos that the Pentagon has claimed are official, taken by military personnel, they do not show anything that supports what the pilots claim they saw. It's interesting to note that in the 2004 Nimitz encounter, which Commander Fravor has talked at length about, there's only one other pilot that's come forward and talked on the record, and she describes a completely different scenario than Captain Fravor describes. He claims he was in visual contact and within coordination of this object for about 3 minutes, I believe. She says she only saw it for a handful of seconds, like less than 20 seconds. And all she really saw was something near the water with a disturbance in the water. And if it hadn't been for the disturbance in the water, she never would have seen this thing. She did not corroborate what he saw. And the video that was the only one that we now can verify was a 2004 Nimitz video. That doesn't show a tic-tac-shaped object at all. It doesn't show anything doing anything out of the ordinary other than what their infrared cameras could sense. So until they release more data and more videos, I have to say, sorry, this is an unproven event.
So you're talking about the 2014, the Fleur video?
2004.
Yeah. Well, it says here 2014 on your.
Now there's, okay. So
Sure.
when these first three videos first come out in 2017, and they're released to, of all people, Tom DeLonge and the To the Stars Academy, which, by the way, then employs ex-military people like Luis Elizondo and Hal Puthoff. They originally make it sound like the first three videos were all connected with the 2004 Nimitz event. It later transpires that the second and the third video were from 2014, weren't even in the West, weren't even in the Nimitz area. It was over on the East Coast, off the coast of Virginia. And those involved the USS Roosevelt. So there's been already some backtracking and some misstatements on the part of the Pentagon and the people who were taking these videos. So those were later ones. The first video was only from 2004. The second two were from 2014 and 2015. And those were with the Roosevelt, not the Nimitz.
Okay, now Louis Alessandro, he's also writing a book. He's going to publish a book. So what do you think that book's going to be about?
It's going to be about 200 pages and about 1995, and it'll make them about $500,000. Other than that, I have no idea. So it's interesting that he claims that he has other information, and Jeremy Corbell also claims that he's seen classified data, except neither of them have released that information. And if they're being shown classified data, they don't have a classified data clearance. They don't have a top security clearance. Who's showing them classified information? And if it's declassified, why aren't they showing everybody? So there's a lot of.
He's still on the payroll. Do you think he's still on the payroll, Alessandro? I've heard
it would not surprise me. Yeah, it's possible. We have since found out, I think it was Philip Klass, who was an arch debunker from way back. Mm-hmm. It turns out he was, according to some information, he was being paid to be an arch debunker.
Well, that gets into Dr. Greer and that whole CE5 group thing also that the government works with. And I heard they're on payroll. Now, I just heard, apparently, being, journalistic here, apparently it hasn't been proven. And nobody's ever come across and talk about it. They're not going to talk about it. That's more disinformation or more secrecy that they keep from us. To boil it down, David, what do you feel that this is all about?
Well, one of the best UFO incidents that has happened in the last 50 years is the one I alluded to before, the one from 2017 in October, of an actual white tic-tac shaped object.
Right.
Which leaves Nevada, flies into California airspace, is spotted on radar, makes a greater than 90-degree turn to due north, drops off of radar, but is continually seen visually, and then outpaces commercial airline traffic as it flies to roughly Seattle. And it's spotted by aircrew after aircrew after aircrew as it's moving along to the north. Now, dropping off of radar is not a difficult thing. I point out in this one article, we have these little metallic attachments that are magnetically locked onto an F-35, which is so stealthy that it looks like less than a hummingbird, looks like a bumblebee on radar. But we don't want to have these things flying around in our airspace and not being able to see them. So we have these things called Lunenburg devices, which are magnetically locked onto the outside of an F-35. You can turn the magnet off and these things fall away, which is very helpful if you're going to go into somebody's enemy airspace and you want to look like, say, a Cessna or even a commercial airliner. And then as you're approaching their airspace, you drop off your Lunenburg projectors and boom, you're off of radar. And then you can go about your military business. So this object did this. It was then spotted by these air crews at about 4 miles distance to the east. And because it's 4 miles away, you really can't discern anything. You can't really tell if it has wings or a tail or anything. but it definitely looked like a white tubular object, and it's flying really fast to the north, definitely faster than the 500-mile-an-hour commercial airlines. We know all this because in the next year, in February, the FAA releases transcripts and the audio recordings between the pilots, the FAA controllers, and this guy who represents the military, whose authority name he uses as a code name to the FAA to prove who he is. That's redacted. And he uses it twice, and it's redacted both times. The FAA releases not just the radar tapes that shows this thing going from Nevada into California, it also releases these tapes that basically show that the military guy is going to vector in some armed F-16s. And he's telling the FAA and the pilots, get out of the way. And the pilots are like, what the hell are we supposed to do? Do we go down? Do we go left or right? Do we go up? What do we do? It showed that we were completely unprepared. We looked embarrassingly unprepared for an event like this. Now, we know that the FAA hates to release data. The 2000 UFO that was spotted in the St. Louis area near New Year's Eve, that one, the FAA claims that the military radar at one of the Air Force bases nearby was off during that time period.
Oh, Scott Air Force, yeah, Scott Air Force.
Yeah, except that radar is on all the time, 24/7, 365, and I believe they actually have a backup radar in case anything happens to that one. That thing never just goes off, and it doesn't just go off when there's a UFO in the air. Okay,
Yeah.
We know that in the Stephenville incident, a number of people wanted to see the radar tapes, so they petitioned the FAA to have the tapes, and the FAA said, we don't have those tapes, and they had to go to court. The judge says, show them the tapes. So they showed them the tapes, nothing on the tapes. So they went back to court. The judge said, show them the tapes with the UFO. Oh, well, we have a couple of F-16s, but they're just flying around. They're not doing it. And the judge told them again, show them the tapes with the F-16s going on afterburner. Oh, the FAA says, the ones on afterburner, yeah, we got those. And yeah, they're on afterburner, but they're not chasing anything. And the judge is pissed. And the judge is like, I'm going to start throwing people in jail if you don't show me the complete whole tape. And finally, after dragging their feet over court appearance after court appearance, the FAA finally releases these tapes, and it shows a big UFO, and it flies way faster than the F-16s, which are on afterburner trying to chase it. And they're headed, just like the witnesses said, right towards the Bush Ranch. And
there was a reporter there, and I met her at a convention one time, and she talked about this story, about the frustration she had. And she literally kind of broke down and cried about it because they were proving her to, or trying to prove her to be a liar, and other people in the town, about 100 plus people. And actually some pilots actually saw this aircraft too. So,
well, besides the F-16 pilots. So now we have this 2017 event, and knowing how historically the FAA doesn't want to provide any evidence, it is astounding how cooperative they are. They don't just provide the radar tapes, they provide the audio transcripts. You can listen to these audio transcripts. You can listen to how scared the pilots are when the guy with the redacted code name tells them to clear the area, and they're like, what the hell does that mean? You don't want to get shot down by your own planes.
Yeah.
So if the FAA is willing to release that and make us look so befuddled, they had to have an ulterior motive. And I think that ulterior motive was to tell the Chinese and the Russians, look what we are flying. We have this thing, oh, scary stuff. It's a UFO that sometimes it's on radar and sometimes it's not, and it can go really fast and, that kind of thing. What's interesting is 2 weeks after these tapes get released, Vladimir Putin, in one of his most important speeches, finally releases details about what he is calling this nuclear-powered stealth cruise missile. Mm-hmm. And he does a big presentation about how this is going to change the balance. And it basically sounds like Putin is saying, okay, so you've got back-engineered technology, well, we've got this. And it's interesting that in the video accompanying this, they don't show a target area in the United States of Washington or New York. They show Mar-a-Lago. They show Florida. So you can tell that they're trying to pull Donald Trump's tail at the time.
Yeah, and some of the experts come on TV and they said, no, I don't think it's Russian. Yeah, no, it's not China. It's not their products that's flying in the sky. So they tried to give us some self-assurance, but along the play that they have scripted is disinform us, keep us out of the loop.
So this 2017 event basically happens in October. It's just 3 months after these 3 UAP videos, and they keep harping on the fact that it's a tic-tac shaped UFO, except that none of the videos really show a tic-tac shaped UFO. None of the 5, not the 3 original or the 2 after that. And it's interesting that there's have been since then 2 other incidences of a white tic-tac shaped object overflying commercial airline traffic in the Southwest, one in Arizona, one in New Mexico. And it is screamingly fast. But in all 3 of these incidences, the 2018, 2019, and the 2017 events, sorry, I think one of those is 2021, none of those have the same flight characteristics that Commander Fravor is talking about. They don't stop, they don't make zigzag turns, they don't, zoom down to 60 feet and then zoom back up to 200,000 feet. They're basically just very fast, tubular shaped objects. They're nothing more than a hypersonic cruise missile. Okay.
That's an angle. That's a pretty good theory or angle, but we don't know for sure yet.
We don't know for sure, but we know that the only thing we can say for certain from those 3 incidences is it goes really fast, and in only one instance does it actually make a turn. All the other incidences of these 3 events with this actual tic-tac shaped object, it's just going really fast on the straight line.
Now, before I ask you for your sources, journalists don't usually give those out, but this 2021, the triangle video, do you think that's a TR-3B? We're supposed to have a triangle vehicle.
Which 2021 triangle video?
It was the USS Russell.
Oh, that. No, that is not a TR-3B. If you, Mick West and a lot of other people have shown that all that is somebody with one of those $100 night scope attachments you can put on your cell phone.
Right.
And if you don't have your cell phone set to give a crisp enough picture, if you don't have it set for the right distance, you're going to get a shutter that closes down to a triangle. And every object that you see that comes through there is going to look like a triangle. Okay? There are multiple triangles in that video. All it is that somebody who has an out of focus cell phone camera is taking pictures of an actual airplane with FAA avoidance flashing strobe lights on it.
And getting the aperture.
And the stars and the planets behind it, and maybe some other ships in the ocean. It's kind of hard to tell. And all of those are triangles because somebody has an out of focus camera. And doggone it, the Pentagon knows this. It's not a like, oh, the Pentagon doesn't know what an out of focus camera is. Of course they do. So does Jeremy Corbell. He should be ashamed that he's trying to claim that this is a fleet of triangular shaped UFOs. Bull hockey, it's not.
I have to admit, in my experience, David, back in 2011, it was April, I saw a giant triangle craft that flew over my head 50 feet. I was right in the center of it. I had 2 brothers and my mother lived right down the street, and they saw it too. And it was as broad as 9 houses on the block. It was huge. It just made a kind of a hissing sound from the center. It looked like a ventilation shaft with slats in it, like a barbecue grill. And it had, of course, the 2 large lights on each corner. And the front, it had 2 big glass globes hanging down, about 15 feet long, about 5 feet wide. And they weren't lit up. So I don't know what that was all about, but I saw one of those. And I talked to a guy about, I said, why would they come over a populated or residential area? The military don't normally test equipment over populated areas. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if something crashed, the cat's out of the bag. Right. We don't test the F-117 over Dallas. We don't test the B-2 bomber over Phoenix. We test those things at, Groom Lake and other undisclosed locations where if they crash, we can pick them up right away.
Yeah, it was shock and awe when I saw it. And I just stood there. And of course, when these things happen, they happen real quick. I heard you mention that earlier, that things happen so quick that you don't have a chance to get a camera or take a film. It just happens within about 15 seconds. And then by the time you think about getting a camera, you don't want to leave. You have your eyes locked on this object, like you were with that MIB guy, and you were looking at him and everything else. You saw the Cadillac, you got the details, but a lot of times you don't have the chance to do that. And they are speaking to one person at a time. I really love that when you said that earlier, that that maybe they're showing themselves to people one at a time and not in large groups. Large groups may see something at a distance, but nothing really close up at like abductees. Did you say you were abducted or whatever one time?
I had what might have been a dream. It's very hard for us as human beings to determine whether we're dreaming something when we're in bed or whether we're being abducted. I know a lot of people have had experiences where they wake up in bed, but I've had some pretty lucid dreams that I know are dreams. However, that being said, I had an event once that was so striking, it wasn't like any other dream I had, where I was going to go camping. I was staying at my aunt and uncle's house out in the woods west of Paducah, Kentucky. And I was sleeping on the floor, and I woke up in this dream, and I felt like I was waking up in the dream. And I was sitting on a round dais, and I was sitting in front of 20 or 30 people who, if we have Monty Python fans listening to this, all had a white Professor Gumby, knotted handkerchief on their heads. And they all wore solid color T-shirts, like, Star Trek officers. There was yellow, there was green, there was blue, there was purple. And they were all intently focused on me. And off to the left, there was a guy in a chair, and this guy had the most luxuriant beard I could have ever imagined. And there was a kid next to him, and the guy in the chair told the kid, spin him. So the kid comes over to me, and he touches this dais, and it spins like a CD player. I mean, like, couple hundred, couple thousand RPM.
Right.
And I instantly have an out-of-body experience. And I knew from research that if you're having a real out-of-body experience, what you normally see is this silver cord that stretches from your body to you wherever you are. And I was in space, and I was looking down at the Middle East. And I could see that part of the Middle East was in diagonal stripes of different colors, which, the old atlases would show disputed territory, like the Sinai, with a diagonal color that showed Israel and a diagonal color that's showing Egypt, so that they both claimed ownership. And I could see the land like that. And there was a message that was right in front of me, like written in the sky, except there was a gray block in front of it, so I couldn't see the message, like I wasn't ready to learn what this message said. And as soon as I saw that, I went, oh, God, like this is God talking to me. And as soon as I said that, I slammed back into my body. I fell off the dais, I rolled into a corner, and I remember I had blood at the corner of my lip, like I'd bitten my tongue, and I had white powder on. And right then, I woke up bolt upright in bed, or in my sleeping bag, as the case may be, and I heard something running off into the woods from outside my aunt and uncle's house. Was that a dream? Was that an abduction experience? I don't know.
Well, a lot of times, yeah. I talk to a lot of other people with UFO experiences, and we talk about there's got to be a seed planted. Like if you see a UFO up close, within 150 feet, they say, Dr. David Jacobs has wrote about this. He said they got you, they nabbed you. If they show themselves that close, if there's a seed planted, then your lucid dreams, your regressed dreams, and I've had several very regressed lucid dreams that I can remember every detail. I didn't have to get up and make notes. It's burned into the mind. And
I know that I've had precognitive dreams since then, where I saw people in my dream that I later recognized in real life. I saw a location that I had not been to. And when I saw it in real life, it was like, oh, that was the dream I had 3 months ago. I think deja vu might be the same thing. Deja vu is just us remembering something that we've already visited. And those deja vu moments are sort of like a, what would you call it? Like a signpost that we're on the right track, that we're on the right path, that we visited this spot. And if we get to this spot, then we're on the right track.
Right. The ETs can control us consciously. They can actually show us what they want us to see. And they will leave tidbits in our minds of what possibly could have happened to you. I know from that experience that I've seen these little tidbits, and I can't dream these things up. I'm not a creative writer, and I don't. When I have these dreams and I have these really far-fetched things that I'm seeing, I said I can't make that up. A lot of times you can't. Why? It's just that's what all of us experiencers have, that dilemma.
David, let me ask you a question. What a lot of what you described, I would equate to the nuts and bolts side of the phenomenon. Um, and then you talk about your out of body experience. Paraphrase it. What do you think the agendas of all these experiences are?
I can't say for certain that the paranormal or parapsychological experiences have anything to do with UFOs or their content. It may be they're as mystified by that as we are. They may be studying us so that they can better understand it. Maybe they want to learn how to play guitar, upside down backwards like Jimi Hendrix did. They're so fascinated by all the things that we humans can do that we are the lab rat of the universe because we can do so much. So I can't say for certain that the paranormal events are created by, enhanced by, or even tapped into by whoever, whatever these creatures are. Okay. One thing that I found that was really fascinating is I met a fellow who claimed that he had been visited multiple times by Sasquatch in an area of northern Wisconsin. And he differentiates Sasquatch between Bigfoot because Sasquatch, he says, are a combination of a humanoid, possibly pre-Homo sapiens sentient, and some off-world entity that they're crossbred between. He claims that they can use portals, that they can appear or disappear at will, that they can walk through walls, and they can go to their other planet and come here whenever they like. As opposed to Bigfoot, which may be, we are 95% Homo sapien and 5% Denisovian and Neanderthal and other. Okay. Well, that might mean that there are some creatures out there that are 95% the other, the Denisovian and the Neanderthal, and maybe in the 30,000 years that we've developed tools, they've developed psychic abilities to camouflage themselves. We don't know. But
We've got someone lined up that's
right,
going right down that track that's scheduled to speak.
So his discussion of Sasquatch suggested that they have the ability to mimic humans, almost like a tape recorder. Okay. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but tape recorders can do that, right? Okay, sure. So there was this event that happened back in around 2004, 2005 in my house, actually in the field where we saw the UFO. A friend of mine who's a very well-researched crop circle fan, he and I were in this field by ourselves. We had music playing on my Jeep, and I was singing along to this music. And then the music stopped, and I heard myself singing the exact same thing I just sang from the woods, except it had not just my voice, but the music that was being played at the exact same volume. And I turned to my friend and I said, "Did you hear that?" He goes, "Yeah, I did." And it was chilling.
That is strange.
And it's taken me about 9 or 10 years to figure out what that might have been. And I realized if this is Sasquatch or whatever we consider Sasquatch to be, it might be that they have the ability to
mimic.
Well, not just mimic, but to capture reality in a bubble.
To reflect it back or something. Yeah.
Almost like quantum mechanics. Like they can adjust reality to replay exactly what happened, but not in a way where they're singing it or that they're doing it with a machine. They're doing it their minds or something.
They're narrating it. Yeah. That's interesting.
And I've never had that experience before or since, but it really kind of shook me up because, the woods I live next to have knee-deep poison ivy in the summer and tons of branches and bracken and fallen over trees.
So you hear something out there, yeah.
Oh my God, nobody in their right mind would be out there. Especially in the middle of the night. There are no paths. You basically can barely get through there in the winter when all the poison ivy and the firegrass and stinging nettle are down. There's nobody.
I think there is a growing awareness that there's something more to the whole Bigfoot Sasquatch phenomenon than just from the 1970s books that we all read growing up. That there's another layer to that, and I think there's a growing awareness of that.
Right. Now, Dave, you asked before, what was the connection between say, the aliens, the watchers, and our experiences,
Right.
it seems likely that people who are more likely to experience these kind of events have gone through near-death experiences in their past. There seems to be some sort of connection in many cases, not all, but in many cases, people who have had near-death experiences are sort of awakened somehow to a psychic or paranormal way.
Right.
I have,
Yeah. Going back to Bigfoot, we're going to have a researcher on, Rob, I think next week.
Yeah.
Very fascinating. And he talks about the consciousness of the Bigfoot creature. He says it's dimensional. It can disappear and be invisible, just like you said. And I've got a couple other people who go on adventures and look for this stuff, and they're going to probably be on the show later on. But they say the same thing, that this Bigfoot creature is invisible. And this Toby Johnson, that's his name, he's got some interesting stuff about the Bigfoot that he said they're invisible. They can come in your house, leave little trinkets and little gifts, and then go back out of your house invisibly. And they do that in the woods too. You leave something on a tree, they'll come up and they'll take it and they'll put something in its place.
And I've read many accounts of that happening.
Yeah.
That's not just an isolated thing. That's
Right.
a fairly common thing. Yeah. Huh. That's interesting.
So it supports all what you're saying, David.
so I'm going to take another really hard right turn and get completely off of UFOs for a second.
Okay.
So in the time after my Men in Black encounter, I wanted to do some other different kind of research. So I started studying ancient archaeology, and I studied, the Giza pyramids, and then Machu Picchu, and then pre-Inca stonework. And I've really thrown myself at this area of research for two reasons. Number one, there appears to be overwhelming evidence that some higher level of technology was used to not just create some of the stonework, but to leave behind things like 6-foot diameter saw blades that were used to cut granite. And we see this now in an object that's in the Cairo Museum, where there's a giant granite box where they were going to cut the side off and use that as the lid for the sarcophagus. And they had dual running saws of 6-foot diameter blades. And at some point it went like that, and it went in too far and it broke off part of the stone, and they just abandoned it. Well, that thing is sitting in the Cairo Museum, and we can see it. And we know that the Egyptians did not have 6-foot diameter saw blades. Who did? Not only that, but there are numerous instances of core drills through granite and marble at a rate that is 10 times faster than we can duplicate with our own diamond tip drills today. We've seen, boreholes that go straight through granite in Central America and South America that could not have been done by a society with, basically pre-Bronze Age tools. There's places in Pumapunku where there's straight line cuts so sharp you can cut yourself on them with little tiny drill holes that if you use a micrometer, they are perfectly spaced apart, thinner than a straw. This is not our technology. This is somebody else.
And how was that dated, David? It was the scientist earlier said it's probably 15,000 years old, but now they're saying it's older than that.
Well, depending on who you listen to, this Russian researcher named Velikovsky thought that Pumapunku was oriented to something that was around 20,000 BC. Okay, I can't say he's right or not. He made some other claims that seem to be a little wrong. He may be right in this instance. The only thing we can tell for sure is that there is undeniable signs that there was high technology being used throughout the world. And we're having this long-running discussion between some of the really good archaeologists and tour guides. Brian Forrester, if anybody wants to see some really interesting videos, watch Brian Forrester's videos where he shows from Egypt to Central America to South America to Easter Island. They were putting stones together so tight that you could not put a knife blade in between them. Except you can't do that when some of these stones weigh 80 tons. And some
They were melted?
Well, they're
Melted as far?
The prevailing two theories that I'm fighting against are that it's either geopolymer or that they had some ability to melt the stone or soften the stone. There is a bird in South America that with its saliva, if it eats the right plant, it can soften limestone and then dig out the limestone and make a hole in there. That's great. There's a legend that supposedly the pre-Incas were able to do that too, except you can't do that with granite. You can't soften granite. The theory that I like is there's a legend that there was a man and woman that came down from the sun and then appeared out of Lake Titicaca, which gets into this whole legend that Brian Forrester talks about in that Graham Hancock talks about in Fingerprints of the Gods, where there are repeated stories of bearded white men, Dave, that's us, bearded white men, who came out of the water and then proceeded to educate the locals on what to do and what not to do. You have Oannes, who did this around 4000 BC in Sumeria, who actually was dressed in a fish suit because he apparently could come and go into the water at will. You have Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha in Central and South America. Viracocha, which, by the way, means the foam of the sea or the foam of the ocean, because the last he was ever seen, he was walking straight into the ocean and disappeared. Okay, and you have these beings who could do almost anything at will that they wanted. There's a story that Graham Hancock has in Fingerprints where there was some locals who thought that Viracocha was some sort of demon and they were going to stone him to death. So Viracocha falls to his knees, implores the heavens for his fellow guys up in the sky, and he calls down a rain of fire. That so terrifies the locals. They're like, dude, don't kill us. We were just kidding. We're friends. We're friends. Let's work this out. And Viracocha supposedly.
Yeah, let me talk about the secrecy of all this stuff. They're hiding a lot of this. Scientists. Howie Sawas, remember him on TV all the time? He was a director of movies, and
I hope he's selling tour guide books somewhere.
He's
part of the Ministry of Archaeology.
Yeah, he's been kicked out. He actually absconded a few artifacts, I think, and he was kicked out now. And he was really highly against the ET involvement in ancient Egypt. So he was kind of a firewall for protecting the secrecy there. And then you get into the Smithsonian. A lot of people are talking about the Smithsonian are hiding a lot of giant bones. And I know, Rob, you're interested in the giants, and we'll have a show on that before long. But they're hiding a lot of the giant bones. They're hiding a lot of other artifacts that you can't get to. The Smithsonian works, I guess, for the government. And then you have the Vatican that has a lot of artifacts and they won't let loose. So there's.
I think the Smithsonian is actually a privately funded institution.
Really? Well,
that's where the name comes from. This guy named Smith actually funded this whole thing to start in the first place. And I wouldn't go. I try to be hesitant. I don't want to get in trouble like Brian or Mick West when they make claims that people say are too didactic or too, rigid. It's been said that the Smithsonian has these bones, and they may have these bones. Unfortunately, we haven't found any really large bones in the last 120, 130 years or so. I was just reading that there was a series of bones that were found in France around the I don't have the dates exactly, 1880s, 1890s. And there were 3 bones that, if they were human femurs, would have indicated a body about 11.5 feet tall, except nobody did enough research. It was never peer reviewed, and the bones are now lost. And that's the last time I know of that there was any physical evidence of a giant human being. All the rest are just stories. And unfortunately, we don't have anything we can test. And until we can test it, we have to accept these are interesting stories, and these legends occur throughout all civilizations. We just don't have anything we can prove.
Yeah,
there's
apparently in Ohio or Indiana, one of the two, where they found giant skeleton bones. The next day, 2 or 3 guys dressed in black come and picked them up, put them in wagons, and took them to the Smithsonian. Yeah, took them away.
By the way, one of the most interesting Men in Black stories involves Thomas Jefferson. When he was writing the Declaration of Independence and he was stuck, he'd go out and sit in this little park next to Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And some dude in a long black trench coat and a black hat would sit next to him and talk to him about what needed to be in the Declaration of Independence. And this was in the summer when Philadelphia is amazingly hot and humid. Why anybody would be dressed in a long black coat and a black hat talking to Thomas Jefferson in the middle of the summer, I don't know.
But that was Saint Germain. They called him the professor. You can look it up on the internet, the professor.
Okay.
He was
Okay.
actually there. He was actually pushing them to go ahead and write this Declaration of Independence, and they were all afraid because they were going to die if they got caught. The British would kill them. So he told them, go for it. He said, you're going to make a good country. This is going to be fabulous. This will work. And he says, I'm going to go up on the balcony, and when you're all done writing this thing, I'm going to come down and take a look at it. This guy was tall and he wore black, like you said. He never ate anything under the ground, only above the ground. And he drank tea. It had to be hot water. He didn't drink any water, from the stream or anything. So he was a strange guy, and he was called the professor. And you can see that story. I think that's who you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things I like about ancient archaeology is that the stones are right there. You can go and see the stones. You can have people videotape them. You can see them. You can test them. You've actually got something physical to hold on to. It's so different from the current UFO, UAP videos where, I see videos every week where somebody is really good at computer graphics and they make a triangular UFO look like it's going through a portal in the sky. And it's like, bravo, that's really good technology. What program is that?
Yeah.
But when you look at these stones and you look at, at Baalbek in Lebanon, there is the trilithons, which is this big giant platform with curbstones. And on top of the curbstones themselves are somewhere between 50 and 100 tons. There are these 3 blocks that are so massive, we estimate they weigh 1,000 tons. And there's just no way that normal humans could move 1,000 tons. We have the Serapeum at Saqqara. Saqqara is one of the areas where there's a big pyramid. Underneath the ground, we have discovered recently in the last 50 years, there is this long square hallway. And off the hallway are these little niches, 20 feet deep, 10, 15 feet wide, with these massive 100-ton blocks of stone with a top on it, black granite, which we now are being told by archaeologists were the repositories of the Athos bulls, these sacred bulls that would be sacrificed for their cult. Except there's never been any bodies found in any of these sarcophagi. And the weird thing is, in this hallway, there's a block of this stone, this sarcophagus, unfinished, unpolished, sitting in the hallway at an angle that somebody just abandoned. And right ahead of it is the top, is the lid for the sarcophagus. And it looks like they just stopped. There is no evidence of torches being used in this enclosed area, but this one unfinished sarcophagus shows that they polished it once they were put into the niche. Except the niche is so small, you can't get more than 5 or 6 people in there at a time. And there's just no way that you could move an 80, 90-ton block of stone with a few people into these niches and then polish it in the dark. So that particular object is one of a recurring series of pieces of evidence that shows that whatever was going on in pre-Inca, pre-Egyptian, pre-Sumerian times, circa around 10,000 BC, when we think the end of the last ice age occurred, which may have came at the same time as the end of the Lesser Dryas. There's something called the Lesser Dryas event, which we now theorize was a meteor or some kind of astronomical object coming in, maybe breaking up and being multiple parts and hitting from Canada across Greenland into Russia and melting so much of the glaciers that ocean levels rose 300, maybe 400 feet in a relatively short period of time, maybe as little as a week. We know that about the same time, this ocean water overflowed the Mediterranean and possibly the Black Sea too.
Right.
And when this event happened, it was so cataclysmic that we think this is what's recorded on the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, which we now know is 10,000 BC.
Yeah, in your opinion, David, I mean, they found some modern human bones in Illinois, Calhoun County, about 90 or 100 feet down in an old coal mine. And these bones were modern human, and they aged them, or they checked out to, I guess, the age of them. It's 260 million years old. We have been here for some time, off and on. Do you believe that we started and stopped in different I guess,
Well,
creations.
it's possible that we've started and stopped. The problem with dating any living material, whether it's bones or trees or anything like that, anything that was alive, the only thing we can date is the carbon-14 content.
That's
And
what
we
they
can,
did. Yeah.
right, except carbon-14 doesn't go back millions of years. It only goes back a few tens of thousands of years, maybe 100,000 years. We can't date past that. What we can do is we can date the layers that they're in
That's it.
and look at features that those layers may have encountered. Like, for example, we could go throughout the Earth, and at 65 million years or so, we'll see this layer of dark material that looks like a lot of fire worldwide, with right before that some evidence of a comet or a meteor because it contains iridium. And iridium is a non-natural, non-Earth mineral that's carried in by non-Earth, objects, comets or meteors.
But
So
they
when we see iridium,
Yeah.
we can tell that this is a non-Earth event. And we
Right.
can see that right at that point, at 65 million years ago, there aren't any dinosaur skeletons above that point. There's no fossils. They're all prior to 65 million years ago. So we can date things that way.
Well,
I'd be
yeah.
curious to find out how they dated them to hundreds of millions of years ago. I know that there's this famous, there's been a series of things found in coal mines. The problem with coal mines is most coal that we dig out, like in Illinois, for example, is soft coal. And it's not difficult to drill into soft coal, even with just using, an ice pick, and put something in there and then claim, look, this is 600 million years ago. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it is.
Well, you were correct. It's the striations that they look for. The
Right.
level, and
Right.
that's what they said these human bones were at this level of the striations.
Except I'm willing to bet that if you did carbon-14 dating on those bones, you'd find that they are not beyond 30,000 years old, that they're probably Native American bones that they repositioned down there to make it look more interesting.
Okay, speaking in terms of disclosure, I
I'm
guess.
just being,
Yeah,
sorry, I'm just being the devil's advocate there.
Yeah. but do you believe that ETs have been involved with our ancient history? Let's going all the way back to the Old Testament and all the biblical characters there when they said Noah was tall, light, blonde, blue-eyed.
Okay, well, and I've discussed this at length with people online too. The stories from the Old Testament, you have to understand how those stories were created. The first 5 books of the Bible were supposedly written by Moses' own hand,
Mhm.
except they weren't written down until the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon. And at that time, they finally wrote down their stories because they were afraid they were going to get lost because they didn't know how they were ever going to get out of Babylon. These stories then are talking about events that happened with Moses 600 years before. And they had been playing, at least for 600 years, telephone tag. Hey, I heard this story. I'm going to tell my son's going to tell his son's going to tell his son. And we don't know how much of that might have gotten missed in translation. A perfect example is the story of the Moses bringing the 10 plagues to Egypt.
Mhm.
Those appear to have been very similar to what would have happened in Egypt if you had a massive tsunami caused by a massive volcano, which is exactly what happened at Thera circa 1500 BC, which is not far off from when Moses may have left Egypt. You have, if you reorganize them differently, you would have had a giant explosion with fire in the nighttime and smoke in the daytime. You would have had a seiche, which would have lowered the water from the Nile, so the Nile would have been exposed. You could walk across it. And then you would have had a massive flood, which would have brought mud up onto the shore and water, which would have then caused the eggs that had been buried there to fertilize and populate. Then you'd have a whole bunch of, locusts, basically, flying midges and things, which would cause the frog population to explode. And then you have all of this iron-rich soil going back into the Nile, which would make the Nile look red with blood. And if you're drinking that, you might lose a bunch of people to sickness and disease. And frankly, it would look like they're killing the firstborn of Egypt, but in reality, it would kill a lot of people. They only worried about the firstborn. They didn't worry about the little people. So if you reorganize that series of events, you could honestly say this sounds like the result of what happened with Thera. And then as the Israelites are leaving and going into Sinai, they're guided by what? They're guided by a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night, which is what they would have seen if Pharaoh was still going on. So that's an interesting way to show that the Bible might have records that are somewhat accurate, but disorganized or not perfectly well understood. So this happened at 1500 BC. Prior to that, you have Abraham leaving Sumeria, leaving the city of Ur. And he carries these stories from Sumeria with him, with his people. And these stories then become part of the lore of the Israelites until they set down in record form when they're in Babylonian captivity what this is all about. We are reasonably certain right now that a lot of what they talked about in these first 5 books includes some intentional errors where they couldn't say, for example, that the Babylonians were their overlords, their slave taskmasters. So they attributed that to the time when they were in Egypt and claimed that the Egyptians were the overlords and the slave masters. Except we can now see that there was a group of people called the Hyksos that ruled northern Egypt during the time up to about 1500 BC. And in fact, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten was half Hyksos. His mother was a Israelite Jewish woman who believed in a mono-god, a singular God religion. And that's what Akhenaten wanted to have. He wanted to have the one God of his mother's religion.
Okay, you write fiction, so you might get a chuckle out of what I'm going to tell you here. What I'm trying to do is tie together ET involvement throughout our history, disclosure where only the higher ups, the high priest and the queens and people like Solomon's temple and Solomon and King David and all the bloodline, they kept this to themselves. And they could have been ET blood or into that bloodline with ET, and they kept everything secret from the workers, just like us now. We're like workers or farm animals, and then you have the rich people and the bankers that control the world. It's been like that ever since our human history. Somebody's kept locked doors away from the public. I'm trying to tie the 3 together. ETs, biblical terms.
Fictionally only?
Yeah.
Fictional. Okay. Here's a fictional story you love. I'm working on this one idea called This Never Happened. Okay. And it's a screenplay about a woman in Iraq who's an intelligence expert who's supposed to decode Taliban and ISIS transmissions. And one day she gets one that's not on the horizon that comes in from outer space. And it turns out it was not being sent to her originally. It was being sent to Guantanamo base. And it somehow got misdirected and she intercepted. And she learns through a bunch of different experiences that there's a fellow in Guantanamo that is the last surviving member of the group of people that met with the aliens during the Eisenhower administration when he supposedly met with the aliens and supposedly signed a treaty. And he's being kept in Guantanamo, and everybody else there, all the ISIS members, all the terrorists, it's just a screen so we can keep him isolated from everybody else. And he's been there for 27 years. And his deal is he's the one that's supposed to communicate with the aliens, and they're getting mad because he hasn't spoken to them in 27 years. They keep sending messages down, and he can't reply. And at the end of the screenplay, he basically tells the aliens he's allowed to finally communicate. He says, don't trust the humans. They're invested in power. They want to make war. They're destroying the planet. Do whatever you want. I don't care anymore.
Yeah, let's get back into the fiction again. How about the Nephilim? The angels that fell.
Yeah.
Well, they were giants.
Well, okay. So this legend starts with Sumeria, which is around 4000 BC. But these stories might be a memory of what happened before the Lesser Dryas event at 10,000 BC, which is 6,000 years earlier. At that time, the evidence I'm looking at suggests not just that there was an ancient race that was able to use high technology and what looked like massive power tools, but it looks to me like they were trying to teach the locals how to use their stone cutting devices. There's a place called Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where there's these beautiful zigzag walls. They're called the Dragon's Teeth, that include massive stones. But at the bottom of the original stones, the earliest, the oldest stones, there are these little rectangular depressions. It looks like somebody just took a knife and just scooped out a little bit of the stone. It looks to me like they're signing those stones. Only later on do you then start seeing when they're making the stones flush on the face rather than leaving the natural facing stone. When they're making them smooth, occasionally they'll leave these little protuberances, which are called chins. And people can't figure out what these chins are. Some people claim, well, it's where they had scaffolding, except no, these stones are, dozens of tons. Those chins wouldn't work and it's not where they're pulling them up by ropes. To me, it looks like it's the opposite of these rectangular depressions. Now they're leaving a stone to show how much of the stone they cut away. They're showing how this is what we removed to make this flat. There's a really interesting location in China at this one quarry where there's this massive, 100-foot long natural stone outcropping where they've carved underneath the stone outcropping and left it in place with a couple of stone pillars, but they've left these big knobs on the outside, and these knobs are a foot long, foot deep. So what they're saying is we carved all of this stone away. And they didn't do this with bronze chisels, and they didn't do this by banging stone on stone. They had some technology that could cut the stone away. We now have these things called plasma cutters that can sublimate the material that they're tuned to. And what they can do is you can run this thing across iron or steel, and you can remove rust or paint without harming the surface underneath. And what it does is it sublimates this material, which means it turns it into a gas and bypasses any liquid state. You have to vacuum out the gas, obviously, but it's possible that in some of these locations, another example is the Long Yu caves, which are also in China, where they removed an estimated 2 million cubic feet of stone. Yet there's no debris pile. Where's the debris pile? And the interior of this area looks like somebody had like a big curved device that just went through and made the same cut over and over again and just dissolved the stone right into whatever surface they want. That same type of, curved area with a little tiny ridge between the areas, we see that in Egypt. We see that in Central and South America. It's like they're using the same device all across the world.
And it was probably used by special people or people that are in the know, and they taught other people, like Solomon. And we can go back into what also with the pyramids. Do you think the pyramids were built for energy? Did they create an energy from those pyramids? They were not tombs, I don't think, right?
I talked to Christopher Dunn. I respect that he's done a lot more research on this than me. He has the idea that the Great Pyramid, not necessarily the other two, but the Great Pyramid might have been used as an energy source. If it was, then it would need a ballast. It would need something to regulate the amount of energy. And we know now that there is at least some sizable area of a void to the west of the Grand Gallery that we haven't gotten into yet. And if we find some material there that could act as a ballast, like he's theorizing, then yes, that could have been a power source. However, most people don't realize that the Great Pyramid, most people see it from the east looking west. And you see the King's Chamber, and there's the Grand Gallery that goes downward. And then there's a horizontal layer that goes to the Queen's Chamber. And then that goes down to the descending passageway. And then there's some other stuff below ground. And it looks really cool. Okay. It has the most passageways of any pyramid that we've found to date. What they don't realize is, and there's only one book that I've ever seen that shows this picture, is if you look at it from the north, you see a straight line on the west side of all of these passages that's perfectly lined up to the west. And they all go off to the east, and they form a human figure. The area below ground that has all these different, unfinished floor areas looks like the feet. The Grand Gallery and the Queen's Chamber looks like the thorax and the abdomen. And then you have this area at the top that looks like a head with the 5 relieving chambers over top of the King's the King's Chamber, looking like a 5-layered crown. This was not by accident. This was intentional. They were showing us this is human. This is you. And they're doing that in a way that proves, for example, that this was not designed as a tomb, and they changed their mind twice. And first they were going to put it below ground, and then they were going to put it in the middle. And then no, they did this on purpose. They did this on purpose to hide this message for us to find out later.
Yeah.
I think,
Did you hear
I
of
think
Mike? His name is Michael Myers. I think he wrote a book about, he said it was a hydraulics underneath the pyramid that created the energy. And they had the Nile flowing underneath of the pyramid, creating some kind of a vacuum pressure pump. And it
I've
created energy.
heard that,
Yeah.
except that the Great Pyramid is not watertight. It could not work that way. In fact, one of the interesting details about the Great Pyramid is after it was built, there was a massive earthquake that cracked the granite blocks over top of the King's Chamber. And somebody knew the secret that if you go down the descending passageway, you can't go up the ascending passageway. There are two granite blocks blocking. When you go down all the way to the bottom and you tunnel to the west, there's a little grotto that is part of a natural water spring that used to be on the hill underneath the Great Pyramid. And we believe they terraced the hill, but kept the grotto in place. And after this earthquake, somebody went down there, went into that well, that grotto, went up, came up out of the grand gallery, where they left this perfectly positioned location so you could just pop out by moving one stone, went up the grand gallery, and then tunneled into where the relieving chambers are above the King's chamber, and checked to make sure that these blocks hadn't broken. But that shows that at that point, there's big cracks in the pyramid, and it could never have been watertight. It could never have done the work that they claimed that it would have had to do. I can't say for
The
certain.
pyramid is definitely not a watertight mechanism by any means. Yeah.
Yeah. However, it's also interesting that you have the Great Pyramid, and one of the websites that I watch religiously is Ancient Architects, and he had a video earlier this year in June where he talks about how the second pyramid, the Khafre pyramid, and the third pyramid, the Menkaure pyramid, both had lower levels of pink granite on them, whereas the Great Pyramid was fully encased in white Tura limestone, polished so brightly that it was probably the first building in history that did not cast a shadow. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, the Great Pyramid is not four-sided with a base, it's actually eight-sided, and it's actually concave. So it would actually focus the light into a beam up above it, which is bravo for that.
It must have been really pretty. Yeah, it must have been really a pretty sight.
Yeah. So the second and the third pyramid had pink granite in the lower casing stones, and nobody could figure out why. And he came up with this theory, or at least he talks about this theory, where it was because towards the west you have higher ground, and you had runoff water that had already destroyed some other buildings in that area that were not so protected by granite. And it's possible that they protected the lower areas with granite, knowing that there would be runoff water. Except there was never that much water during dynastic times from 4000 BC onward. The only time there was that much water was 10,000 to 9,000 BC at the end of the last ice age, which also matches up with the erosion seen around the Sphinx, which also had to come from water runoff. This is not sand erosion, this is water, which proves that the Sphinx is also older than 9,000 BC.
Right.
So that's interesting that they're showing that all three pyramids, at least with their casing stones, appear to have taken into account the wetness of the conditions from that time period. Now, the rub against that is Menkaure, for example, had a sarcophagus in it. But if you look at the Khafre and the Menkaure pyramids, their only accesses, their only buildings or rooms, excavations, are all below ground level. They don't go into the pyramid. They go below ground level and under the pyramid, both the Khafre and the Menkaure pyramid. The Great Pyramid is filled with passages, and the Great Pyramid has no carvings in it.
Right.
None.
Right.
So
here's something else I wanted to ask you. This thing about the pyramids, they're saying that they weren't tombs, so, and they don't really know how old they are. But the latest research they've been finding, they had this underground radar. They found rooms in the Great Pyramid that they still have to go in and try to discover. They got spaces underneath the Sphinx also that's underneath the front paws, and they said there's a room there. They say there could be a lot of secrets or a library in these rooms. What is
There's a Roman historian who talks about actually going down there and seeing this vast complex with all these different rooms and all these different pillars, and he hasn't been wrong about the other things that he claims he saw. There's at least 3 areas right now that we know of in the pyramid that display anomalous readings. One of them is this massive void to the west and about the same height as the Grand Gallery, which is the ascending part that goes into the King's Chamber. There is an interesting setup of stones in the King's Chamber where it looks like you could pull a stone out of the north wall, the exact same size as the sarcophagus, the granite sarcophagus, which maybe suggests that they pushed the granite sarcophagus in and then pulled the stone back. It's not really clear, but it's clear that there is a stone that does not bear any weight above this stone that looks like it could be removed, and it has a crack in it, as if there's weight on top of it and it needed something underneath it, and this stone was not supporting that weight. So there's that area, and then there's another area to the east on the outside of the pyramid, which shows that it's cooler behind these stones, so it shows that there might be a void there. Okay. One of the other interesting theories that's going on that I just heard this year was the person that is credited with breaking into the Great Pyramid. His name is Al-Ma'mun, and he did this around, my memory is correct, around 800 AD. And supposedly he dug straight into the limestone by using cold vinegar that they threw onto stones that are heated by a little campfire. And the hot limestone, when it meets the vinegar, would fracture, and then they would like take it out, sort of like mini dynamite. So supposedly he goes straight in and then makes a left-hand turn, and voila, he happens to find the ascending passage. What a stroke of luck. Boy, that guy's the luckiest man since, I don't know who, no. Except that doesn't pass the smell test. There's no way you'd know how to go in and how to turn in order to do that. There's just no way. So some guy made a theory this year that what he did was he was able to get in through some other passageway, maybe the same guy who came in after the big earthquake, after the pyramid was finished, and checked out the relieving chambers. He may have gotten in that way. And then they got to the King's Chamber. By the way, the sarcophagus at that time used to be in the middle of the room. They moved the sarcophagus off to the west so you could get more people in the room. When it's in the middle of the room, you have a granite sarcophagus with probably a granite lid that if you sat in, surrounded by granite and all this stone around you, would give you one hell of an out-of-body experience. Mm-hmm. Okay, we know that granite is mildly radioactive. Radioactive would probably give you an out-of-body experience too. And it's possible that this was an initiation chamber for people at the time. That's why there's no body. That's why there's no, mummy or engravings. This is just for you to experience.
Maybe so, magnetic energy also, because magnetic energy will actually dumb you and everything else. Sure. I want to ask you a question about.
Okay. Before we get off this, so this theory is that that's how Al-Ma'mun got in. That he got in through the lower passageway, got to the King's Chamber, and then wanted to prove what he had done. So he decided he can't move the sarcophagus. It's too heavy. It's too big. So he and his boys take the lid. Except they go down the ascending passageway and realize they can't get through the granite plugs. So at the bottom of the ascending passageway, they go to the north and they dig out to the north, and then they go straight out until they hit the outside. And one of the reasons that this theory makes sense is because where they have to make a turn, they make a wide room for this turn, like they're carrying something with them. And that thing that I think they're carrying is the lid from the sarcophagus, which means that that lid is out there. And one of the interesting things that I found out, and if your viewers can ever educate me on this, back in 2010, during the Arab uprising known as the Arab Spring, there was a lot of threats of people stealing antiquities from the museums and whatnot. And people actually made human chains around the museums in Cairo and other places in Egypt. Well, while this was going on, nobody was watching the Great Pyramid. And in the middle of the night one night, a group came in with heavy equipment and a flatbed and excavated something on the Giza Plateau, something rectangular that they moved all the sand out of the way, picked this thing up, put it on the flatbed, and drove out. They were supposedly with armed guards all dressed in black with no uniforms. So somebody knew something was there, knew what it was, picked it up and took it. I remember seeing this story online. I remember seeing a before and after from surveillance pictures that showed lots of sand and then this big rectangular hole, not very deep. But to this day, I can't find anybody who's been able to verify this story.
I heard something about that story too several years ago. It could have been a military operation in which I'm going to take you back to ETs again here in Egypt.
Sure, go ahead.
With the elongated heads, Tutankhamun, and his queen mother, they all had elongated heads. Do you think?
I think it is.
Yeah. Do you think that's ET involvement with the technology also?
It's unclear. There's so much that we don't know about Tutankhamun. There's one of my favorite books, one of the ones I mentioned to you earlier, is Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark by Lawrence Gardner, where he talks about the Ark of the Covenant, how that matches the ark that was found in Tutankhamun's grave goods, which, by the way, where he was buried was never intended for him, was intended for one of the wives, and they just kind of threw all his stuff in, which is why when they excavated it, it was just like all over the place.
It's really rough artwork too, compared to the other tombs. It's a
Yes.
slapdash effort. Yeah.
Yes. So Lawrence Gardner theorizes that the Ark of the Covenant was an insanely advanced technological device. And one of the things that was supposed to go inside there is a pot of manna. And he shows how manna was given to the pharaohs to extend their lives. And whenever it was displayed, it looked like a little triangular pile of sand. Well, he points out, we now know that you can take gold and make it into monatomic, which is gold where the electrons sort of follow each other in a pattern rather than just being scattered all the way around. When you do this with gold, it becomes a powder. It becomes superconductive, which is really helpful if you want an Ark of the Covenant that can float and levitate and fly on its own. And it also gives off a big flash of light. And he points out that one of the early archaeologists in the 1890s had found this temple in the mountains in the Sinai, where they found all this dust, like below the platform, like buried in secret. And this archaeologist was throwing this dust in the air, thinking that it was ashes from a ceremonial fire, thinking he would find bones in there, and he never did, so he didn't think it was anything. That could be monatomic gold. If that was monatomic gold and it was used in the Ark of the Covenant, somebody was making a sophisticated electronic device that could gather electricity like a capacitor and then release it using some kind of superconducting technology.
Hence, that's why people got burned up that didn't know how to handle the Ark of the
Shot with lightning, yeah. Moses's two nephews
Right.
were hit that way. And there's a story about how when they were going through the Holy Land, they sent a couple of scouts up to the Bekaa Valley, where supposedly there were giants. And when they came back to Moses, they told him, we are as grasshoppers, we are as insects in their eyes. So what did they do? They sent the Ark of the Covenant in by itself, and it supposedly burned them to dust with pillars of fire.
It was the first special weapon that Israel owned.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I used to live up north, and there are many still oral traditions of talking about the giants in the area. So we're closing in quickly on the 2 hours. What future projects do you have in the works, and what are you most proud of that's yet to be released?
Well, considering that none of my screenplays or novels have ever been published, I'd like them all to be published. I've actually been working on the second book of Eternal Horizons. Eternal Horizons takes a character who's modeled after me, who has the ability of psychometry. He can touch objects and read their past. The first chapter, which I sent you guys a link to, is this small 3-person team of which he's the lead, and they go to all these mysterious locations around the world. And in this first chapter, they're in Aksum, where supposedly the Ark of the Covenant is being kept in this little building. Except if that little building held the Ark of the Covenant, the Knights Templar would have found it,
That's
a
true.
couple of thousand years
Probably
ago,
not
and
in
they would have taken
Ethiopia.
it.
Yeah.
By
Oh
the
yeah,
way,
I wanted to ask you about you're a Templar scribe. What does that mean?
um, about 20 years ago, when I first started researching Oak Island, long before the two brothers that are there now, I wanted something that showed I had done my research into the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar had three groups. They had the knights and the sergeants of arms that did the fighting. They had the priests who could read and teach them, the things from the Bible that they needed, because the knights couldn't read. And then they had the scribes. And I figured if I could at least be a scribe of the Templars, I'd feel like I was doing a good job. And we know also that Thoth was the scribe of the gods. He wasn't exactly a god. He was talking to the Egyptians about, this is your gods. Let me tell you the story of your gods. So a scribe kind of felt like a worthwhile position to have. So in Eternal Horizons, they are looking for the Ark of the Covenant. And there's this story that Solomon had relations with the Queen of Sheba, and some 19 years later, this boy shows up and goes, "Daddy!"
Mhm.
And he's like, "Who are you? I'm your son." It's like, oh my God, that's right, Sheba. Oh, I almost forgot.
Yeah.
But then he supposedly hangs around for 2 or 3 years, and then he supposedly leaves with the Ark of the Covenant and a whole bunch of the firstborn of the ruling families. And then he goes to Egypt. He stops off at a place called Elephantine Island, where we now have found remnants of what looks like a place where an Ark of the Covenant would be kept,
That's
with the same
fascinating
dimensions.
place. Yeah,
Yep,
absolutely
yep.
fascinating.
And then supposedly they went on all the way to Ethiopia. Except when the Knights Templar show up around 1100 BC, 1100 AD, they follow this same trail. They go to Aksum, they go to Ethiopia. They may be responsible for some of the rock-cut churches that are there, and they don't find the Ark of the Covenant. And they come back and they do a whole bunch of other things, which includes building Chartres Cathedral. Chartres Cathedral is one of the most magnificent cathedrals ever built. It also has stained glass that reportedly allows in more light at dusk and sunset than is visible outside. It almost magnifies the glass. Okay. And they had built this beautiful labyrinth in the middle of the floor with this pattern where if you walked it, it was symbolic of you taking a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So if you weren't rich enough to go to Jerusalem, you could walk this labyrinth on your hands and knees, go to the middle, and then walk your way out. And that was doing enough penance to satisfy people.
So
In
that
the middle,
yeah. that
so
means that
in the middle of this,
yeah, our
in
ancient
the middle of this
relatives.
thing, so
Okay.
they had a brazier on 3 posts, and the stubs of these 3 posts are still there. And this brazier was 200 feet below the ceiling and 200 feet above these chambers that were underneath this hill where Chartres Cathedral was built. One of these chambers below ground supposedly had one of the original Black Madonnas, this Mary and baby carving, which is so old that the wood turned black. And there's a whole legend about Mary Solomar that came up from the Mediterranean, who may have been Mary Magdalene, who was cast adrift by the Israelite elders because they didn't want her stories to get around. Regardless, they were going to put the Ark of the Covenant below ground, and in this brazier, they were going to have this monatomic gold, and above it, they were going to have a natural magnet, a lodestone, and somehow they believed this was going to open up a portal. And if the Ark of the Covenant had ever been found by the Knights Templar, that's where it would have been. And they never put it in there. Therefore, I believe they never found it.
And these ancient people, where'd they put this church you're talking about? Is it a church or some kind of you said it was beautifully done with the windows?
Chartres Cathedral?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Where's the location of that?
In Chartres, France. It's in northern France.
Right. Okay. All right.
And the other thing that's interesting is, you got all these other cathedrals, and it takes huge amounts of manpower to build these things and tons of money. And most of them are in these big cities. And it was a sign of the importance of that city to have, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and all these other places where you had to put together a lot of effort and a lot of money to make these things built. The Templars built. The Templars built Chartres Cathedral. They didn't need anybody's help. All you had to do was, if you wanted to help, bring some stone, carry some wood, bring us food and water. We'll pay for everything ourselves.
You know, like Rob was saying, we're running out of time. I guess we are pretty close right now, Rob.
We are
Uh,
at the end. But
yeah,
listen, I want to have you back because you've touched on a bunch of things that I'm highly interested in, from the redaction of the oral traditions to Oak Island, and Oak Island especially.
right. Mhm.
So yeah,
By the way, there's a big secret about Oak Island that the brothers have not found out yet,
hmm,
that we were beginning to uncover back around 21 years ago or so. And it's far more fascinating than the fact that the Spanish buried gold there, and then the English found that, and then they buried Francis Bacon's papers, and then the British found that, and then they buried some of their treasure too. Sorry, the French buried some treasure, and then the British found that. Those are four different burials over top of each other, but there's something below that, below the 190-foot bedrock line
that's correct.
that they haven't found yet.
It definitely seemed like a reoccurring safe, essentially,
It
repository for
does.
a bunch of
It
different
does.
things in Europe. Yeah, definitely. It's fascinating. That's a series that I was like
Yeah,
glued
we're going to
to.
get into those giants, Rob, and we're going to get into and I wanted to get in the book of the Enoch. You know, that's
Book of Enoch. Yeah, that's
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I studied comparative theology, so I did all the exegesis and
okay.
stuff.
Uh,
So that's a subject I want to get into too.
I guess we better sign off. You're the producer.
Yep.
You tell us to go.
But listen, I want a commitment that you'll come back, please.
Oh yeah, sure. Anytime. I'd
Awesome.
love to. And
Awesome.
I appreciate the fact that you have me as your second guest after Philip Mantle, who was a
No. This
brilliant,
is
wonderful guy.
Yeah,
this is the exact type of stuff we're looking for. That you go into the depth that we want, and I definitely I'm going to hold you to that commitment to come back because I've got a list of
And
questions.
if any of your guests can't make it, just give me an hour's notice so I can,
Okay.
tire out the cat so she won't come in and bother me.
I'll send out the contract. Okay,
all
good,
right.
good.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to say good night, I guess, Rob. This is Dave Emmons, and our guest, the guy that really threw some good ideas at us tonight. He's going to be back, and Rob
Good.
wants to be back. And I like him. I knew he was sharp before he even come on the show. We talked about that, Rob. So David White, you'll be back, and from me, DNN here, Dave Emmons and Rob. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, David. Take care.
Okay.